What's up guys, it's Nino. So today I want to talk about frequency separation. I know that has been talked about to death, but I want to show you some demonstrations that I think could help you understand it a little bit more. Now, most of us know how to leverage it if we've used it. We either have an action or we know how to set up the whole entire procedure to make it happen. And we're usually pretty happy with it for the most part, right? Let's go over how to create it, how to create a frequency separation, setup. Just to be thorough, for those who may not know. And then we're going to show you some demos and some other demos. And I want to talk a little bit about it because understanding what's happening, maybe not so much the mathematics and the calculations, but understanding what's happening, at least what it means to you as an artist, is very important, I believe. And it also help you understand NBP Action 16 Texture Control Pro, which is a multi-frequency extraction. So for, texture modification of all kinds. We're not going to go over that right now, but let's go ahead and set up frequency separation the traditional way real quick. So we duplicate the background layer twice. For the most part, we label one low for low frequency, and we label the other one high, Now, we use a blurring operator, a filter, to determine, how do we blur our low layer. Now, traditionally, people have used Gaussian blur. Real quick demo, that's obviously really high. You're supposed to blur it until most texture is gone, right? That's what they say, right? But if you blur it a whole lot, you lose your hard edges, you lose your perimeters, and depending on what you're doing in the end result, you may have problems with those perimeters because it'll create haloing. So people don't generally use that. Another option is surface blur. Surface blur will preserve, as you can see, lower these numbers a little bit, it'll preserve your edges really nicely. But it makes some interesting choices on what it blurs and what it doesn't, and it can be a little unpredictable. So while that's better than Gaussian blur, it's not been the most popular, even though it works great. Another one is median, probably the most popular one right now, the prevailing one that most people use. It preserves edges reasonably well, but it pretty much stays a nice consistent blurring across everything. Some people will run it multiple times to create their low layer. So we're going to do that now. We're going to go ahead and run it at 15. All right, just for grins, and hit OK. Now we go to the high layer. This is all part of the frequency separation process. Image menu, apply image. Then we choose our low layer that we're going to target. We choose a subtract blend mode with an opacity of 100%, scale of 2, offset of 128. You get this strange result, which you may or may not be experienced and seeing. And then you take that high layer and change it to linear light. End result, the image looks identical. Okay, you have high and low, and now your frequencies have been separated. All right, so if we look at our low frequency, we see it's blurred, and we look at our high frequency, we see a strange version of the image, but that is our extraction, that's our high texture extraction. But what does that radius mean? And why do people say, well, blur it until you lose texture and then go with it? And why do some people say use a different radius depending on your goal? Okay, well, let's talk about that, and then we're going to do some visuals, okay? So this is right here, this is going to be 15. We're going to turn those off. Let's look at our demos real quick. And what I've done, turn these colors off real quick. What I've done is, this is an extraction, a frequency separation extraction done with median at a radius of 5. Okay, if I turn on the color in between my high and low, which are set up to 5, we can see, I'm going to zoom in a bit for you guys, you can see what's happening. Now, you might not understand what's happening, but when I turn on the 30 radius, which is pretty high, not too many people are going to use that for anything practical, though, never know. Okay, when I turn on 30 radius, this is what I get. Let's toggle that back and forth. 30, 5, 30, 5. Zoom out a bit. Once again, there's 5, 30, 5, 30. So look carefully. One way to illustrate it is this plant in the background. You see how on 30, you see that blurry plant is coming through. Those very low or somewhat low frequencies in the 30 blur range, which has a very slow sort of, transition of frequency. So, it's low contrast-ish. It comes out at 30. At 5, the plant vanishes. It blends into the background because only the finite texture is being kept. Everything in camera blur becomes one giant wash of noise, which is the sensor noise. Okay, but at 30, the plant shows up. So what does this sort of mean? You can see the result on her face as well. You see her tendon in her neck at 30, and then it's gone at 5 because there's not enough, if we turn everything off for the moment, there's not enough sharp, hard, high contrast transitions on her tendon. So because of that, at 5, it vanishes because we're only keeping a certain frequency. So how has it been described? Well, the higher radius that you use is effectively like pushing more texture into the high layer. So this is 5, so it's a low number. So the high layer doesn't have much. It has the thin hairs and the sharp contrast of the eyes and the edges of the nose and all that. And then the tiny texture of her cheek and her skin, and there's a lot of sensor noise in this shot. You get that But when you use the 30, you push more texture up. You still have the 5 in there, but you have the broader texture in there. Now, there's a practical use limit. 30 is high. You can't go 300 and benefit from it. It starts to look like just a washed out version of the image. 30 is actually really high, like I said. It's not that practical, but occasionally. So what does this mean for you? Well, this means that now any modifications that you make to the high layer, you'll be modifying more texture, broader texture. Okay. And if you paint something in between, like we did with this color, then that color doesn't affect the texture as much. There's a lot of broad texture that's still preserved, so you still get a fine texture. When you do it on 5 and do a wash of color, then you really ruin everything, and you can see a lot of the broad texture has been obliterated. Now, how do you extrapolate this into something practical? Well, if you're on 5 and you haven't colored anything in between, when you go to heal on high layer, if that's what you want to do, or paint in between the high and low, you have a certain amount of texture on top and a certain amount below. That makes sense? And on 5, that texture is very fine because we only pushed a certain amount of texture up into the high based on the radius. On 30, it's a lot higher. Now, it's not always obvious. You're like, what is this blurry, halo-y looking thing? What am I looking at? Doesn't matter. That's just you don't have to worry about understanding what's happening. Just understand that means texture. Now, in these demos where we're dumping all this color on top of it, it's not always obvious, but when we use it to paint color in or to heal the top layer, etc. Because if you push texture into the high layer at 30, you can heal the texture that's there. You see that anything you can see here, you can heal it for the most part, right? At 5, some of the texture vanishes. You cannot heal it because it's still in the low layer. At 2 and at 1, it really keeps a lot in the low layer. So they're just different setups depending on what you're trying to accomplish. A lower frequency means that you can do more underneath the texture to obliterate texture, modify texture of all kinds, broad, medium, etc. You can do all kinds of things, but you have a little more responsibility because not a whole lot of texture has been preserved. You can really make something look overcooked fast with a low frequency, with a low radius. Does that mean it's useless? Absolutely not. It has immense use to use smaller frequencies. Smaller radius. I can talk. On 30, again, kind of high, but let's say you use 12 or 15 or 16. That's going to preserve more broad texture. You can do a heavy-handed color painting underneath. You can heal a lot more because there's more texture that's been pushed into the high. So you can heal a little more aggressively if you need to, etc. Again, not better than a low radius, just different than a low radius. Just a different way of doing it. Now, how this varies from number to number, what's the magic number? That's hard to answer because it's not always obvious what the magic number is. Your image resolution, how many pixels you're dealing with, pixel dimensions, 40 megapixel versus 12 megapixel versus 80 megapixel can change what you want. They kind of look that you're trying to get after. How much texture do you need to preserve for what you're after? Whether it's skin, whether it's cloth, whether it's concrete, whether it's a cloud, whether it's a car panel, it doesn't matter. And your subject, whether it's a person or not, how big are they on frame? If they're small, like in an environmental portrait, there's not a whole lot of, detailed texture in there for you to extract. And those high frequencies could be a little too much and it could be a mess. There's so many variables there's no one magic answer. So you can change it up and down. For example, take a look at this animation. This pushes, if you will, it cycles through radius of 1 to radius of 30, back and forth, showing you what the high layer looks like, the extraction layer looks like. It's not the clearest thing on what it's doing, but as you can see, it can be granular. And every little difference can make a difference on what you're trying to accomplish and whether you're going to succeed or not. This is why a lot of retouchers, when we go through our process, will run frequency separation multiple times. Sometimes at one radius, sometimes with a different blurring operator, and sometimes at another radius. It could be twice, it could be thrice, it could be 6 times, depending on what we're trying to accomplish. And it's not always skin, just to be clear, because sometimes there's a time for a 30 radius, rarely, and there's a time for a 5 or a 12 or a 16. Now, we are splitting hairs, no pun intended, so don't sweat. Don't think 16 is so much better than 17. 17 is a disaster. Let's not be silly. We are still kind of trying to find your range and practice. That's the key. Practice. You don't know exactly what you'll need. I have a basic idea when I use my camera because I know the pixel dimensions off the top of my head. I know I've done it thousands of times with frequency separation, so I know headshot versus full length or whatever, where I tend to kind of want to be with my blurring operator radius. but it's not always obvious, right? You have to experiment. You get a second nature kind of understanding of how it works. Sometimes you use one radius specifically for one part. This cheek and under the eye might be bugging you right here, and you got to solve something. You run frequency separation at the right radius that you need for that, and you go. Now, if you have Texture Control Pro from NBP, you can have multiple frequencies at once and experiment and test back and forth on texture replacement if you need. But if you're running traditional frequency separation, you can try one out, see how it works at that frequency. Maybe it doesn't. Try another blurring operator. Okay, gave you a lot of information there, I know. But the entire point is that frequency separation, whether you love it or hate it, you probably misunderstand it, or at least you misunderstand how to leverage it. It's just another tool. You can't hate a screwdriver in a toolbox if you're trying to use it as a hammer. It'll function as a hammer, sort of, but it won't be great, and you can't blame the screwdriver. You have to use a tool appropriately for the right job. Then you have to know how to leverage it. You have to understand its variations. And that is why I want to make this video today. Obviously, if you have any questions, please leave a comment below or drop me an email, nbp@ninobatista.com, because I'm a proponent of frequency separation, but I'm not a zealot of it. I'm not like, use it on all the things, use it all the time. This is the magic of skin editing. No, it's just another tool to separate frequencies so you can control texture in different ways, and that varies a whole lot. So I hope you enjoyed that one. If you have any questions, like I said, comment below. Appreciate you guys.